I hope you will forgive me if I begin to cough up here. I was listening this morning during the sermon, and I just heard coughs from all across the auditorium, as some of you did. I was a few of those. Skylar was enough of those that she thought she needed to walk out. So I guess if she does that tonight, hopefully it's not my sermon that does it to her. January's almost over, which I just find incredible to believe. And while this isn't about the sermon, I want to say I hope you're keeping your resolutions. I hope that you've made some that have been positive, that have helped you, but I especially hope you're keeping those that apply to us here at church. I really hope you're keeping those. I'm trying to keep the three that I put before you the last Sunday before this new year, of growing in my own relationship with God, of encouraging you in the church, and helping those outside of it. So I just wanted to begin by saying that if you haven't started those, or if you've fallen off, it's not too late to get back on them. But as I move into the sermon, let me tell you about my past week. This past week, I began substitute teaching at Mickey. This isn't, of course, a full-time thing. It's a substitute just when I can. But I spent the entire week of school from Tuesday to Friday, because we didn't have school on Monday, substitute teaching for the second grade. It was quite an adventure. I was basically the kindergarten cop for an entire week. We had fun. But I really did enjoy it, however, quite a lot more than I thought I would. I wasn't looking forward to it very much, but I really did come to enjoy it. I've actually filled out this application last fall to substitute teach, but because it took so long to get it sent in and through the school board, the first chance I had to sub was this past week. So while I had done it in the fall, I did it in order to get to know more in the community, reach out to others, get to know people. This was my first chance. And on that form, I had written that I wanted to sub for 6th through 8th grade. But this was the first time they asked me, and I felt a little bad to say no. I felt like it wouldn't look very good if I turned down my first opportunity. So for some crazy reason, I decided the best time to sub would be a whole week of just second graders. To be honest, I'm really glad I said yes. I had fun, and I do still know how to count with quarters and nickels and dimes and use a clock. So that's what I had to teach them, so hopefully I could do it. But I did get to learn something this week that all of you that are parents already knew. I knew it, but it's different when you get to experience it. There's quite a big difference between a kid seeing and hearing something that they're supposed to do and actually doing it. You all know that that's just the case. The second graders were great, but as little kids do, they talked a lot, of course. And it's incredible how you can tell them to sit down and do their work and stop talking, and you turn and you help one kid with how to read a clock, and then all of a sudden the rest of them are all talking again, like you didn't just tell them to stop. Each time I told them to stop, they would hear that for a little while, and they'd stop, but they wouldn't keep doing it. They'd hear it, but they wouldn't do it. Teaching them this week was also interesting, teaching them how to tell time on a clock. Some grasped it very quickly. I kind of joked before, wondering, why do we need to read a clock? All our clocks are digital now anyway. But apparently we still need to learn that, which is a good thing. But there was a great divide between these students still hearing about how to read a clock and actually doing it. For example, take a clock like this that says 3:30. Pretty simple to all of us that know how to read a clock. When I started, we learned the very basics. They're 60 minutes an hour. The small hand is the hour hand. The big hand is the minute hand. The big numbers mean the hours. The little ones mean the minutes. All those sorts of things. And when we were learning how to read the clock together, we did great. All the kids could sit there and tell you just what time it was. They'd look at that and they'd count the hours, and they'd say, it's between the 3 and the 4, so it's the 3, and then they'd count around by 5s, because you don't give them very hard ones. It only on the big numbers is where the minute's at. And they could get that, and they'd get it done, and they did great. But then when we split up to do their independent work, suddenly this clock was no longer 3:30. Somehow, to all of them, it was 3:06. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Somehow, both the big numbers are the hours and the minutes. Right? And I'm saying that because this is another example of kids seeing and hearing what they ought to do, but not actually doing it. They should have counted the tiny marks, or by 5s up the big numbers to get the minutes, but they just couldn't. And by the way, I had to teach Friday about how to do half-past or quarter till. That was a disaster. I don't think any of them are ever going to talk like that. But hopefully the great kids at Mickey in second grade did learn how to read a clock, at least for the time being. I say all that to say, though, there's quite a difference, between hearing something, seeing something, and actually doing it, knowing how to do it. Those kids heard about and saw how to read a clock, but doing it was a completely different matter altogether. In James chapter 1, the end of James 1, where we're going to be tonight, we find a section that really speaks about just what we've been talking about seeing and hearing and doing. James calls his audience to be doers, not only hearers in their Christian life. John Paul has titled our study through James, "A Faith That Works." And that's a great title because of all the themes and sub-themes in this book. They all come back to this, living a Christian faith that works in this world. Our section tonight is no different. We as Christians are called to an active and living faith, a working faith, a faith that does, a faith of doers. And to help us remind us of that working faith, James ends chapter 1 by telling us all about that. And he begins this admonition to do with this call to righteousness. Consider these first two verses with me, or first three, excuse me. "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." This call to righteousness begins with instruction to be quick in hearing, but slow in speech and slow to anger. This isn't uncommon. In fact, still today, we say things, although a little differently, that are very similar. You might hear someone say, "You ought to listen more than you speak, because you have 2 ears and 1 mouth." You've probably heard that said, or maybe even said to you when you were younger. Why is this, though, given by James in his call to righteousness? Well, it's because we need this reminder. What do we do most often? When you feel like someone's attacking you verbally, do you say, this time I'm going to sit back and wait, I'm going to listen, see what they have to say, see if I can really understand them before I respond and attack them for what they're calling me? When you get angry, do you take the time to cool down? Do you hold back on your words? Or are you like most people, do you speak out and you lash out at them for whatever they said? We need to be told this by James because many of us struggle with this. It's a great challenge in this call to righteousness to be slow in our speech, slow in our anger. We have to respond to this call. And this is what he says in verse 20, "Because our anger and wrath never produces the righteousness of God." You see in verse 20 why he says we ought to do these things? Our anger, our quick words, our quick anger never produces God's righteousness. It never does. Our angry outbursts never solve the issue. They never bring someone closer to God. In fact, they always do the opposite. Now, I do want to let us remember, Ephesians 4:26 reminds us to be angry and do not sin. While anger is not always sinful, we often let it lead us down a sinful path. When we're not slow to anger, we often sin. How many issues with a spouse have been solved with a quick remark said back to them in anger? Or has there ever been a marriage that was made better by one spouse lashing out at the other when they were angry, even if their anger was justified? Or how many times has an angry response to your child, because maybe you were tired, or maybe because they truly were being a bit annoying, led to a productive and healthy home? Or how many times has the response of a child to a parent led to a solved problem when they responded in anger, even if they felt misunderstood or thought they're not given enough freedom? Or what about in the workplace? Have you ever solved a problem by exploding upon your coworkers or employer or employees and told them just how terrible they were doing, and that fixed the issue? Or have you ever by chance seen a fit of road rage that was solved by one person getting even more angry than the other? Those things just don't happen. Anger and those words don't lead to a solution. Our anger, and often the speech we bring with it, does nothing but make something worse. It never solves the problem. Our anger will not bring God's righteousness. So why do we spend time being so angry and hurting others? Being slow to anger, though, is only half this call of righteousness. In verse 21, he continues and he says, you need to make new priorities in this world. He says that when he tells us to lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness and then receive the implanted word. Not only should we be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger, we should receive these new priorities. Put away the evil, away the filthiness, the ESV calls it, rampant wickedness that surrounds us. You don't need me to tell you that wickedness surrounds us. You know that. Filthiness and wickedness is seen everywhere. At a national level, there's policies and ideologies that promote evil. At a cultural level, media, music, and movies, and all these things bring a wickedness right into our homes. On the individual level, all of us struggle with this wickedness in some form or another. I don't have to spend a lot of time telling you that. You already know. So what should we do about that? Well, James tells us. He says this call of righteousness instructs us to replace that by keeping the implanted word, that thing which has the power to save. There are but two options in this world that you can follow, the wickedness or the word. I'll tell you, though, only one saves. It's the word that saves us, and that's what he says. We must then receive it, that implanted gift. We've all heard it already. It's been given to us. What a gift. Receive it with meekness. Let us not be boastful that we have it. Let us not tear others down because we are saved, but instead build them up because they can be as well. Receive that word. But once again, as with avoiding the filthiness of the world, you already know that you should receive the word of God. You know it can save. You know you should follow it. So now that we've heard that call to righteousness, we've heard these things we know, we have to ask the question, how will we answer that call? How will we answer the call? Will it merely be heard, or will it be heard and done? And that's why James follows his call to righteousness in verse 22 with what I would say he gives his call to do. We're to be doers of the word and not hearers alone. James says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. I think that this verse 22, is the focal point. It's the hinge of this entire section. It's what his argument here stands or falls upon. And he's pointing out the importance of being a doer. It's really easy to be a hearer, isn't it? Being a hearer requires nothing, practically. Anyone can be one. You know that. Some of the second grade students this past week were hearers. They heard me teach about how to read a clock, but they couldn't really do it. You may be a hearer about many things without ever being a doer. Maybe you tell your children to do something, but they're hearers. They hear it, but they don't listen. You've probably worked with somebody who's told by the boss constantly what to do, how to do it, and they say that they will, but they never actually do it. That's a hearer, not a doer. You can even hear these words from James. You can hear the direction that he gave to be quick to hear, to be slow to speech, to be slow to anger, but will you do it? You can hear the instruction to lay aside wickedness and filthiness, to cling instead to the implanted word. To hear is easy. To do it, however, is hard. It's complicated. We need to be doers. That's certain. James tells us that. But you know, like I know, sometimes we still struggle. So because of our struggles, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about two questions. Why should I be a doer? And then how can I do it? How can I be a doer? First, James begins with this question of why be a doer? Why be a doer? Look with me at verses 22 again through 25. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work. This one will be blessed in what he does. Be a doer, he says. Why be one? Be a doer first, because the hearers are only deceiving themselves. Those who are not doers, those who are merely hearers, trick and deceive themselves. How so? Well, they're deceiving themselves because they think that hearing is enough. They think that hearing is enough. They've tricked themselves into thinking that they are living faithfully, even though they're not. They've tricked themselves into thinking that they're faithful Christians. They've tricked themselves into thinking they're already good enough. They've tricked themselves into thinking, I don't need to work for God or his kingdom. They've tricked themselves into thinking all we need to do is attend church or watch someone else worship. They've tricked themselves into thinking that they've got something waiting for them in heaven. That's what a hearer does. They deceive themselves. We should be a doer and not a hearer alone, because the hearers have been tricked. Satan has enough deceptions for us. Let's not deceive ourselves on top of that as well. But he continues, why also be a doer, not a hearer? Well, he says in verse 23 and 24, because the hearers forget. Those who hear, those who never do, suffer with a forgetful mind. He says, they're like those who look into a mirror. They may look intently. They may stand before the mirror and fix their hair and straighten their clothes and look at their teeth. But when they walk away, they've already forgotten what they saw. It doesn't matter what they did. They see themselves. They see what they should change. But when they're gone, it's like it never even happened. These are the people who hear what they need to change. Perhaps they may be pricked by a sermon. They realize that they have faults in their lives, as we all do, that need to be fixed. They strive to do better. They promise to do better. They listen. They think of the things that they can do in their lives. But when a sermon ends, or whatever it is ends, and they leave the church building, they've just forgotten what was said. They were in front of the mirror, and yet it's all gone. Forgotten their desire to live again for God. They're a hearer, not a doer. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been pricked in the heart, maybe during worship or wherever else you were, challenged by something, by someone, and you resolve to do better, and yet somehow you forget all those changes you wanted to make by the time you got home? I've done that before. We've all done that, I believe. If you've done that, then we're being hearers, not doers. Be a doer, not a hearer, because those hearers forget. They trick themselves and they forget. But there's one last reason to be a doer. In verse 25, he says, be a doer, not a hearer, because the doers are blessed. Of all the reasons to be one, I find this one the most compelling. Yes, I don't want to trick myself. I don't want to deceive myself or be forgetful. But above that, I wish for God to bless me, and I hope you do as well. And God blesses the doers. He who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, as he says in verse 25, the law of our Lord Christ, and continues in it, is blessed. This is so much more than the hearer. You don't merely hear the law, even see the law, you do the law. You follow it, you keep it, you obey it, you continue in it, and you're blessed. Don't you want the blessings that come with being a doer? I really do. There's so many. There are earthly blessings that come from it. While there's much evil on this earth, there's also much good that comes from God. James 1:17 has already reminded us in this book that every good and perfect gift comes from our Father. He sends these earthly blessings down. He's also left us his church to help take care of us and bless us on this earth. There are things I firmly believe that God blesses us with on earth. Maybe not the things we always want or think we need, but God gives us blessings to those that follow him. There's also great heavenly blessings far above the things of earth, those blessings that we can get. Those things where is our home free from pain, where the loved ones await us. Those are blessings that wait for the doers. We could continue all night, though, and talk about the blessings to come. Let's stop short, though, and say that simply the blessings of the doer will be worth it all. So why be a doer? It's because the hearers really don't have it made. They deceive themselves, they're forgetful, and they will not be blessed. We should be the doers. But we know that we should be. James gives us these reasons, but typically our problem isn't not knowing why, it's more often knowing how, isn't it? We know we shouldn't be a hearer, we know we should be a doer, but how can we be a doer? I think that's why I'm so grateful for these last two verses that James gives us, again, 3 reasons for how to be a doer. And the first way is to keep watch over your tongue. James says that if someone considers themselves to be a religious in verse 26, but doesn't keep their tongue, they're deceiving themselves. Look at verses 26 and 27 with me. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. The idea of keeping one's tongue under control is seen throughout the book of James. We already seen it actually in verse 19. We'll see it again in chapter 3, and it's mentioned here in verse 26. Those who are doers control their mouths, what they say. Now this means a lot of things. It certainly means we should avoid using foul language. That's a given. There's no reason for a Christian to use certain words that have certain meanings that are so common with so many people in the world. But I think it goes beyond that as well. To control your mouth means more than just not using certain words. It means you know how to control your mouth when you would rather lash out at someone with angry speech. It means you know how to avoid saying something when it wouldn't be appropriate in that moment. You know how to avoid the gossip or the hatred that so many others are spreading that you can avoid spreading with your own mouth. To be a doer. How to be a doer? Well, you must bridle your tongue. You must control it. We'll speak again more of this in James chapter 3, quite a bit more, in fact. But as we consider this now, know that you must control your tongue. You must bridle your tongue to be a doer. But he continues after that. Do you wonder how to be a doer? Control your tongue, but also care for those in need. In verse 27, James tells us that the pure and undefiled religion before God is to care for the widows and the orphans in their trouble. While I'm not exactly sure that we have orphans here at Acton, at least that we typically think of in the sense of orphan homes and things like that, here in this congregation, of course, we support some places that do. We do certainly have plenty of widows. It should be our duty to help and care for them. I believe the point here that James is making, though, may go past just the orphans and widows. In the time of his writing, orphans and widows were some of the most powerless and helpless people in society. They were those that had no one else to care for them, no one else that could provide for them, and suffer and potentially would die on their own if no one cared for them. He's instructing his readers, care for those in this society who cannot care for themselves, who would be helpless without you. To be a doer, we ought to imitate the same. We must care for the most vulnerable and needy people around us. Perhaps those are, perhaps those are the orphans and widows. Like James is saying, perhaps those are the ones that we see that are the most needy. There are plenty in this church and congregation and community who have no family because maybe they're older and all their others have passed away. Maybe they're young and some tragic accident made them that way. They should be cared for. To be a doer, though, doesn't stop there. Continue to find those past those two groups that need help. Maybe it's a homeless person in town. I understand why we're so hesitant sometimes to help them, but I also wonder, if we ignore them, are we ignoring the people that are in the most desperate need for help? Rather than maybe making excuses, perhaps we can try to make reasons for helping them. Perhaps it's some immigrant or someone who is here on their own who has no support or community to rely upon. Maybe it's the person who's living in financial or material need because of some unforeseen circumstance. The point is, there are a lot of people in need. You don't need to wait to help an orphan or a widow, although please support them as James commands. There are people in need right now. You can stop being a hearer and become a doer when you help those that are the most in need. But there's one final way that James mentions at the end of verse 27. To be a doer, keep yourself clean from the world. The final admonition in this section is to keep yourself unspotted or unstained or unpolluted, depending on what translation you read, from the world. If we're to be doers, we must keep ourselves clean from the wickedness and filth that's so common. You might have noticed by now that this section is repeating at the end what it said at the beginning, actually. In the beginning, it talked about watching our mouth and what we say, and it repeated that in verse 19 and verse 26. In verse 21, it tells us to lay aside the wickedness and filth. And here it's repeated in verse 27. Keep yourself unspotted from that. If it's repeated, that ought to catch our attention. How important is it that we stay pure and faithful in God's service? If we're going to be a true doer, it is most important. It is most important that we let go of the evil and the filth that surrounds us and hold instead to God. Again, as I said earlier, we could speak for a long time of the things that pollute us. We could talk about things on a national or cultural or individual level. Let it be known, however, that whatever it is, no matter what it is, it does not matter. We're called to be doers, and doers let those things go. They keep themselves from that pollution and filth. How can you be a doer? If you're wondering tonight how to be a doer, keep those three things from James. Watch what you say. Guard your mouth. Bridle your tongue. Visit and help those that are the most helpless. And keep yourself unpolluted from the world. By reading and hearing the words of James, we're all hearers tonight. You've heard the call to righteousness. That's what he begins with, because God desires for his people to be faithful and clean in his service. He wants us to control our mouths and our anger, for our anger never leads to his glory. He wants us to lay aside the filth and wickedness and grasp his word instead. But again, it's not enough to be a hearer. That's made clear. Hearers are tricking themselves. They are forgetful. They are the ones who are not blessed. So I ask of you tonight, be a doer. Begin to be a doer by keeping watch over your tongue. Keep from the language and outbursts that so many need. Help those that are in need, those who need it the most. And keep yourself from the sin of the world. None of us here are perfect. And I'm sure in your own mind, you know what that great sin is that you need to abandon, that you need to separate from. With the help of God, you can go from being a hearer to being a doer and abandoning that. So I ask, are you a hearer or are you a doer? There's no option in between. You've heard, so you're already a hearer. You've heard the words of James, his words, not mine. But will you take the next step and be a doer? Why not be a doer tonight? You can be a doer by obeying these words of James. You can resolve to bridle your mouth, to control your anger, to put away evil. You can be a doer by doing God's plan for your salvation. If you don't know what it is, if you need more help with it, we want to help you become a Christian. Or you can be a doer by simply coming forward and letting us help you relieve your burdens. Why not be a doer tonight as together we stand and as we sing?